Hey guys, working on promoting the book, and in an ideal world, that's all I would be doing because it is a full-time job all by itself. But because of current events, can't just do that. Got to do more. So, um, more than a month ago, we did a somewhat lengthy video on the absolute direct comparisons between the slaughter of the people that lived in the Warsaw Ghetto and what's happening in Gaza right now. It is exactly identical. They stole people's land. They moved them into a very densely populated, concentrated area. They put a wall around them. They did everything they could to degrade them. They cut them off from food and medicine. And then when there was a armed response, which, I think would be inevitable among any group of human beings, they responded by completely flattening the place and killing as many civilians as they possibly could. Am I talking about what Israel's doing in Gaza right now? No, I'm talking about what the Nazis did in the Warsaw Ghetto. Can anybody tell me any difference between what the Nazis did in the Warsaw Ghetto and what the Israeli government under Netanyahu is doing in Gaza? I mean, please give me a break. But I also wanted to highlight, and by the way, we're going to run the video again. We ran it over a month and a half ago. I'm still waiting for a professor or an analyst or somebody that's been just doing nothing but covering this story to point out the parallels between what the Nazis did in Poland and what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza. I can't hardly believe that I'm the only person that's seen that. Maybe other people have brought it up, but I haven't seen it yet. All right, so I did want to also highlight a really brilliant piece of propaganda on the part of the Israeli government. I mean, really, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist. I mean, he really could not compete with Israel. Uh, they have outdone him yeah, he's small time compared to the people running the propaganda for the current Israeli government. And that's the tragedy of this. This is the current Israeli government. Remember, not long ago and before October 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu was damn close to on his way to prison. There were over 100,000 Israelis in the streets protesting against him. And his reaction was to pervert or attempt to pervert the courts of Israel to make sure that he and his fellow criminals could stay out of jail forever. So all this that we are doing, and I'm going to describe what the U.S. is doing in a second, is not for the benefit of Israel. It's for the benefit of a criminal and a criminal gang that's currently running Israel. Unbelievable. So what's happened in the last week or less than a week? Well, we've crossed the 20,000 threshold of murdered civilians. And generally, you're talking about a high percentage of women, a high percentage of children. They're the least mobile, high percentage of the elderly, a super high percentage of the handicapped and disabled. 20,000 human beings murdered in broad daylight. So that's one of the things that's gone on. But what else has gone on? The U.S. Congress has voted that if you criticize the corrupt state of Israel, you are an anti-Semite. That is a law now. I don't know how they're going to enforce it, but that is now a law. Pretty good. Again, Goebbels. Look, I don't know. I don't think Goebbels could match this. But we're going to talk about some really slick propaganda in a second. The third thing that's happened. What is the third thing? Can I even read my writing? Oh, our beautiful, completely corrupt. Well, we've talked about the Congress and their vote. Who has voted actively to continue the murder? The United States. The UN has been clear about this. And there was a vote among the Security Council, and everybody said, stop the fighting now. And U.S. said, keep it up. And we even sent them a few $1 billion worth of arms. So in the face of that, in the face of the slaughter of 20,000 civilians, in the face of our basically vetoing the world's desire for this slaughter to stop, in the face of our corrupt, criminal congressional class voting to make any anti-Israel remark automatically anti-Semites, here's what the Israeli propagandists did, and this is where they beat Joseph Goebbels 10 ways to Sunday. He couldn't hope to compete with these guys. If you were corrupt like Israel and you needed to cover the fact that you just killed 20,000 people and that your big partner, the US, has just voted to continue the murders, what would you do? I mean, how do you keep that out of the headlines? This is a problem. This is a real problem because that should have been the headlines everywhere. But what was the headlines instead? Well, I'm glad you asked. They contacted their corrupt U.S. congressman friends who they own. I don't think that's anti-Semitic to say that. I think it's accurate and logical to say that the Israeli government and all the Israeli lobbyist groups literally own the U.S. Congress. So they contacted their corrupt congressional representatives because they don't represent us; they represent Israel. And they had a little hearing, and they brought the idiot presidents of various Ivy League schools who couldn't tie their shoes if they took a 10-week course in how to do it. And they were asked a question: what do you think of the call for genocide? And like idiots, the college presidents didn't say we consider that abhorrent. We would consider the call for genocide against any group abhorrent. Unfortunately, U.S. law, and it is the U.S. law, is that you can call for genocide. I mean, there are people calling for the genocide of the Palestinians. Nobody in the Congress is worrying about that. There are people on TV represented, government officials of Israel on freaking TV calling for the genocide of Palestinians, and nobody in the U.S. Congress is losing any sleep about that. It's not a crime to, any generic theoretical thing you want to say is not a crime. If I say I'm going to kill you and I show up at your door, now we're getting into something that is potentially actionable and criminal, and you can do something about it. You can't, I mean, the university presidents, useless as they are, were correct. We can't stop crazy people from saying crazy things. We can only go after them if they do crazy things. That became the headline. Oh, what a horror. They're tolerating anti-Semitism. No, they're not. They're just stating U.S. law as it is. So that's what's on the headline. Instead of the fact that there's an actual genocide going on right now, the blood is in the streets. Children are being murdered and maimed right now by a government that's engaged in a genocidal operation. That's not in the headlines, but some bullshit about what some idiot college presidents said, which happened to be correct legally. It's just the law. The law is the law. That's what's in the headlines. And that's why I say who's ever running the propaganda show for Israel, for the Netanyahu administration, first of all, they've laid a fantastic infrastructure of corruption in the United States. They can get in almost anybody to say and do anything. Well, they got their little dogs in the Congress to have this ridiculous hearing and create the headline, right? So I asked earlier, how do you keep out of the headline 20,000 dead? How do you keep out of the headline that any American that questions Israel or the Zionist philosophy is automatically now considered an anti-Semite in the eyes of the august U.S. Congress? How do you keep out of the headlines the fact that every country on this planet wants the murder to stop and the U.S. voted for it and is paying for it? How do you keep that out of the headline? You get the people you own in Congress to hold a ridiculous hearing with ridiculous questions. And then you make sure your friends at the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and all these other trash bag garbage people to make that the headline so that we don't remember or notice that 20,000 people have been killed, that our country is actively involved in it. The blood is on our hands, right? And we're not even allowed to say anything, because it's Israel über alles. And yes, I said it. So now the headline is what theoretically is the case on college campuses vis-a-vis the speech related to the idea of genocide while a genocide is being carried out. Brilliant propaganda on the part of the Israeli government. The Nazis could not do any better. They've outdone the Nazis. And we're going to run our movie on the parallels between the Warsaw Ghetto massacre and what's going on in Gaza. I don't see any difference at all. I don't see any difference at all. It's a disgraceful, sad time for the United States, and the tragedies beyond words. All right, that's I squeezed this in. I did it. We're going to be on a call in about 8 minutes talking about the book, What the Nurses Saw. And I hate to make this comparison, but you know the Israeli government's killing Palestinian citizens at the rate of about 10,000 per month. That seems to be how it's working out. U.S. hospitals, under the guidance of the CDC, killed at least that many every month for month after month after month. And it was probably a lot more. That was done so slickly that nobody even noticed. And our book, What the Nurses Saw, is the first book to document that reality. And it is a reality. You know, you can argue with me, and I already have idiots that are. Of course, they haven't read the book. Read the book. Read the testimony. Read the accompanying documents, and show us where we're wrong. U.S. hospitals committed a genocide, I guess. I mean, it wasn't a genocide because they targeted the poor. They targeted people who couldn't fight back. They targeted the elderly. They targeted people that had pre-existing health conditions. So it was a sort of a form of genocide. Anyway, got to get on the call. Please support the book, okay? Nurses, What the Nurses Saw. We are not getting any help from Amazon. They're happy to sell whatever books we can sell, but as you can see, they blocked all our positive reviews so far. I mean, maybe they'll stop that. They did let a ridiculous review that wasn't even related. It didn't even describe the book. It talked about a novel. It talked about characters. It talked about plot. It's like, not a novel. These are real people talking about what happened. But, you know, there's no end to people that are ready to work for evil. Thus, our U.S. Congress, thus all these people that are doing everything they can to hide the fact that the U.S., because the U.S. is involved, and the current government of Israel are actively massacring innocent, defenseless civilians all day, every day, 7 days a week. Hi, this is Brass Check, and we're recording this on Sunday, and I believe the day is November 5th, 2023. And I was going to take the weekend off, but I can't. I keep waiting and waiting and waiting for somebody, a historian, an activist, a journalist, a commentator, to point out the incredible parallels between the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in the 1940s and what's going on in Gaza today. The historical parallels are almost identical. And if you doubt that, watch this.
And the interaction with non-Jews was a normal daily event. That comes to a crashing halt with the building of the Warsaw Ghetto Wall, which goes through the heart of the city and divides Jews from non-Jews as they were never divided before.
Okay. The wall, right? First normal interaction between Jews and non-Jews, which was the state of affairs in Palestine previous to the invasion and occupation. And then what did the Israeli government do? They put the Palestinians in ghettos and they built walls to surround them. I mean, nobody sees this parallel but me. Now we have another clip, and this shows the mentality of the Nazi government and how they viewed the Jews. And I don't see a whole lot of difference between that and the Israeli government and how they view the Palestinians. I mean, listen to the language.
The German army and civilians must in any event be protected from the Jews, immune carriers of disease. The separation of Jews from the rest of the population, Polish as well as ethnic Germans, is a moral and political imperative. Traffic in the centre of Warsaw has also been only minimally affected by the creation of the Jewish housing district. In the interests of the Wehrmacht and the economy, great care was taken to ensure that certain main thoroughfares would remain crossable without obstruction to through traffic. Waldemar Schön, SS Standartenführer, Director of Department of Resettlement, Office of the Governor of the District of Warsaw.
Did you hear that last word in the last sentence? Resettlement. Resettlement. So what did the Nazis do? They took the Jews out of their homes, which were scattered around Warsaw, because Warsaw was a big Jewish city, second biggest Jewish population in the world, second only to New York City. And they forced everybody who was Jewish to move, to resettle into what they called the ghetto. Sound familiar? I mean, they did the same thing. And did they not do the same thing in Palestine? Did they not bulldoze the olive groves of Palestinians, impoverish them, and then drive them into this walled city of Gaza City? And there's more. What else did the Nazis do to the Palestinians? Well, they cut off food. Does that sound familiar? Here's what it looked like in the 1940s in Warsaw.
Night and day, by rail, in carts and buses, Jews arrive here from Polish towns and villages. The individual vanishes in this enormous human mass. People are crammed in, individual faces are unrecognizable.
I don't know about that individual faces being unrecognizable bit. That sounds like TV documentary bullshit to me. I think the faces are very recognizable. But similar thing, resettle, which means steal the property of the people, push them into Gaza City has been called an open air prison, overcrowding. It's the greatest way to degrade people is to put them in an crowded situation, and then deny them food, which is what they're doing right now. Food, fuel, electricity. Does that sound familiar?
In some places, the ghetto walls did not come right down to the pavement. At regular intervals, there were openings at ground level, through which water flowed into drains running along the sidewalks. These openings were also used by children for smuggling. Tiny dark creatures with legs like matchsticks would converge on these openings from all sides. Terrified eyes darted from left to right, and frail paws dragged through bundles that were often bigger than the tiny smugglers themselves.
Okay, and then after living under those conditions for a long time, there was an uprising And well, if you listen to what some Israeli government officials say quite openly, is their goal is to raze Gaza City. They say destroy the infrastructure. Well, what does that mean? That means raze the place, okay? Which is an exact parallel to what the Nazis did in Warsaw. I don't see any difference at all. Just a difference in time and custom and clothing and language and who's the perpetrators and who are the victims.
For security reasons, I order that the ghetto of Warsaw be demolished. All utilizable building parts and other materials of any value are to first be salvaged. An overall plan for the razing of the ghetto is to be submitted to me. We must in any event ensure that the living space occupied until now by 500,000 subhumans and in no way fit for habitation by Germans disappears completely, and that Warsaw, this city of 1 million, always a center of corruption and revolt, is reduced in size. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS.
I mean, just change some words around, put them coming out of different people's mouths, and you're hearing from the Israeli government, right? So let's see what the Nazis did to Warsaw Ghetto, and Warsaw at large,
For security
actually.
reasons, I order that the ghetto of Warsaw be
Let me
demolished.
just fix that. There we go. There are people in the Israeli government openly calling for the same thing, and there's people in the streets of Israel openly calling for the same thing. This is not all Israelis, of course, and certainly not all Jewish people calling for this, but there is a sizable group that is calling for it, and they actually have the ability to do this, to actually completely raze Gaza City, killing who knows how many people, and creating who knows how many refugees, and where they're supposed to go. Gaza City's their home. 2 million, there's 2 million people. That's a lot of people.
Warsaw's Geisha Street concentration camp was set up to hold people needed to demolish the ghetto. It wasn't only blown up with dynamite, but also dismantled. It was completely plundered, and that camp was hell. People died there. On the ruins of the ghetto, the Nazis wanted to create a park for Germans, hence the demolition. The area was to be covered over with earth and turned into a garden paradise.
Okay, having a little trouble technologically, but yeah, that was what they did in Warsaw. They raised it, and you only raise something if you have plans to put something else there. I think that's clearly somebody's plan to go ahead and do that. So I don't know why I'm the only person making a video on this. Can't find anything about it on YouTube. Seems pretty damn clear to me. For those of you that are complaining about somebody having this opinion, here is an Israeli who's a professor talking about the very same thing, calling what's going on right now in Gaza, and has been going on for a long time in Israel, as a genocide. I don't know what else to call it. Certain people have been identified, singled out, forced to live in particular areas, strictly regimented, walled in, brutalized, humiliated. I mean, this is the Warsaw Ghetto all over again, except instead of the Nazis being the perpetrators, it's the Israeli government that is. And it's amazing to me that every person on earth can't see this. And I'm also kind of surprised that this is the only video on this subject, but c'est la vie. That's the end of my part. And I'm going to switch over to the professor talking about why he calls what's going on in Gaza right now, a potential genocide. Though I think the people that have already been killed, which number in the many of thousands, we still don't know why the Israeli superintelligence forces didn't know that this attack was coming, why they ignored the very clear warning from the Egyptians, why the Israeli military sat on their ass and did nothing for 7 to 10 hours. And we've posted it twice now, and I don't see this hardly anywhere else. Israelis themselves are saying it was the Israeli army that killed hundreds and hundreds of Israeli people during the battles. And it wasn't just accidental crossfire. They deliberately used tank shells to destroy. For instance, if a group had been holed up in a house in a failed attempt to take hostages, and notice the hostages were not harmed or killed, then the Israeli army took it upon themselves to shell the house and kill everyone in it as part of a deliberate strategy. And there is at least one case where 150 people, Israelis, died that way. That's just one case. So of the number of Israelis that died during the Hamas military operation, how many of them were killed by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military under orders of their government? We got the sun coming in here. But anyway, here's the video that I want you to see, and that's that.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. A scandal broke out in the Israeli media recently when it became known that the Israeli government has been engaged in a systematic effort to conceal official documents on the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. The documents were collected from Israel's state archives and taken to locked vaults in the Ministry of Defense. Journalist Hagar Sheisaf from the newspaper Haaretz discovered this concealment effort when she visited state archives to re-examine documents that had been revealed before and had been cited by some of Israel's most prominent historians. She was told that the documents were removed from the archives, and she then tracked them down to the Director of Security of the Defense Establishment. This is an institution that is officially charged with protecting Israel's nuclear secrets and not with hiding facts that deal with the establishment of the State of Israel. Here are a few quotes from the hidden documents. Quote, "In the village of Safsaf, 52 men were bound in ropes, dangled into a pit where they were shot. In a raid on the village of Sasa, we blew up 20 houses with everything inside, with people sleeping there. I imagine so. Within 48 hours, I laid these villages flat. Ben Gurion determined that we must destroy them so they will not have anywhere to go back to. Jewish hostile acts were the main reason for the population's immigration." Security officials that Sheisaf interviewed admitted that the documents were hidden in order to prevent them from hurting Israel's reputation and to cast doubt on the work of historians who cited these documents. One of the historians who has researched and written on the Nakba is Ilan Pape, who joins us now. He recently wrote an article for the Electronic Intifada titled "Israel's Latest Attempt to Erase Palestine." Ilan is professor at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. His most recent book is titled Israel. Thanks for joining us today, Ilan.
It's a pleasure to be in the program.
So, in your piece for the Electronic Intifada, you explain that this act of concealment is part of an effort to erase Palestine, not just the history of 1948. What do you mean by that?
I mean that there is a concerted effort by the American administration and by the present Israeli political elite to depoliticize the Palestine issue, to turn it into an issue of economy, of business, maybe of welfare, but not an issue anymore of national rights, of justice, and of self-determination. And one of the ways in which you can depoliticize a national movement is by destroying its narrative, by undermining its narrative. And one of the main success that had been achieved in the last 10 or 20 years was the fact that Israeli historians, using Israeli documents, have substantiated major chapters in the Palestinian narrative, and that this helped to legitimize this narrative and to create a basis for the moral demands of the Palestinians, whether it is for the right of return or for self-determination or for the decolonization of Palestine.
Now, Palestinian historians rarely have access to Israeli state archives because they need a permit to enter Israel first. Jekyll Shores of the Ministry of Defense specifically spoke about undermining historians, mainly Israeli historians such as yourself, to prevent them from reporting what happened in 1948. What has been the reaction from Israel's academia to the Ministry of Defense's effort to undermine historical research?
Oh, we have a very domiciled academia in Israel nowadays. There was one or two voices of dissent or even anger, but more or less, if one can talk about the academia in general terms, it accepts this position by the Israeli politicians or the officials who are responsible for declassification and censorship. You have to remember, we're talking about 2019, when the Israeli voices of criticism have long disappeared, and both the academia and the media are very loyal to the national narrative and to the basic explanation that are given by politicians and officials that these kinds of revelations can undermine Israel's international image and can be abused if they are used by the wrong historians.
I'll go ahead and put this up on the screen. This was from Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Israeli finance minister, so he's a cabinet minister. He said on Israeli TV, quote, "I don't see a big difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, of course, in charge of the West Bank. The Arabs are the same Arabs." Okay, so this puts into context what has been going on in the West Bank that we broke down for you last week, and Counterpoints also covered extensively. Massive escalation in violence in the West Bank. Jewish settlers aided in a majority of the cases directly by the IDF, pushing Palestinians off of their land, killing over 100 just in the time period post October 7th. So while this war has been being waged on Gaza, you have over 100 Palestinians in the West Bank being murdered there as well. So he's laying out the groundwork here for, hey, Hamas is not just Gaza. We see the West Bank. We see the people who run the West Bank as being basically the same as Hamas. The, quote, Arabs are the same Arabs. So it gives you insight into the thinking of some of the coalition partners and one particular cabinet minister in the Netanyahu government. And Sagar, this is what we mean when we say this is the most extreme government that Israel has ever had in their history. And just to add one more that I referred to before, go ahead and put this up on the screen. Another far-right minister saying that, quote, nuking Gaza is an option. Population should, quote, go to Ireland or the deserts. This was in an interview, a local interview, where this minister he's the heritage minister, was suggesting that some kind of nuclear bomb could be dropped on Gaza. He was asked the question, whether this would be a good idea. And he said, quote, that's one way. He also voiced his objection during the interview to allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza, saying, quote, we wouldn't hand the Nazis humanitarian aid, and charging that there is no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. This is exactly the type of dehumanizing rhetoric that throughout history has been used to justify genocide. Because if there are no uninvolved citizens, there are no innocent civilians, then, hey, no problem to just wipe them all off the map. He goes even further. He backs retaking the Strip's territory and restoring the settlements there. Asked about the fate of the Palestinian population, he says, quote, they can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves. He says the Northern Strip has no right to exist, adding that anyone waving a Palestinian or Hamas flag should not continue living on the face of the earth. This is a government minister who is saying these things, and who, again, we have said, no red lines, no matter what, do what you want to do.
Joining me now is one of the signers of that statement on the possibility of genocide in Gaza, Omer Bartov, Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Professor Bartov, who is an Israeli-American, has been described by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as, quote, one of the world's leading specialists on the subject of genocide. Professor Bartov, thank you for joining me on the show today. I wish it wasn't under these circumstances. Even a lot of people who are critical of the Israeli government, critical of the war on Gaza, they hear the word genocide and say, hold on, that's a step too far. That's hyperbole. This isn't Rwanda. You are a world-renowned expert on genocide and an Israeli yourself. What makes this, in your view, possibly a genocide?
Well, thank you for having me. And indeed, this is not the best occasion for any of us. Look, I mean, I think that the situation we're facing now, as the statement that you read earlier that I co-signed indicates, is one where the possibility of genocide is staring us in the face. You have cited many statements made by Israeli politicians, by Israeli generals, which indicate an intent. One of the most difficult aspects to prove in genocide. And in fact, these leaders have used statements that appear to show an intent to genocide, to commit genocide. My own view is, as far as I can tell, being here and not on the ground there, and depending on reports like most of us, is that what is happening right now in Gaza can quite clearly be seen as war crimes, potentially also crimes against humanity, possibly may become genocide. I don't think that what is happening there right now is genocide, and there are conflicting statements also from commanders on the ground who are claiming that they are using a great deal of military force, but what they're trying to do is to kill Hamas operatives, and they are trying not to kill civilians, although, as you've said, they have not done so very successfully. But I think it's very important to stress that the danger of genocide is right there, and that if things progress as they're going right now, what we are seeing now may become much worse. There are also very threatening statements that you haven't cited, which have to do with an intent to ethnic cleansing. One statement that became public is from the Ministry of Intelligence, which is not a particularly important ministry right now, but that is talking about removing all the Palestinian population from Gaza to the Sinai Peninsula, to the Egyptian side of the border. That would clearly be an indication of ethnic cleansing. And one thing we know about genocide is that it often begins with ethnic cleansing. In fact, that's what happened in the Holocaust. So what we are seeing is a very, very dangerous moment. And if no stop is brought right now, things may very quickly deteriorate.
So, Professor, some defenders of Israel point not just to steps taken by the Israeli military to ostensibly reduce civilian casualties, like dropping leaflets, telling Gazans to evacuate, but also to the fact that the Palestinian population in both the West Bank and Gaza has increased over the decades. So how can Israel be behaving in a genocidal way, they say? The British writer Simon Sebag Montefiore, in a very viral essay for The Atlantic last week, said demographic shrinkage is one obvious marker of genocide, and yet the Palestinian population has grown, he says, and continues to grow. Is that a fair defense?
No, I don't think so. No. Look, one issue with genocide, and that's when you referred to Russia and Ukraine, was quite relevant, is in the case of Russia and Ukraine, Russia refuses to accept the possibility of there being an independent Ukrainian state. It doesn't want to kill all Ukrainians. It wants to actually destroy the idea of a Ukrainian nation. And Israel has had some agreements with the PLO, with the Palestinian political leadership, but by and large, there is a very strong push in Israel with the multiple Netanyahu administrations to make the Palestinians somehow go away. This is actually not happening only in Gaza, but also on the West Bank, where violence by settlers protected by the military and often with the help of the military are increasingly exercising violence against the Palestinians there. And there are dangers, and many Palestinians would say so, of a second Nakba, of another expulsion of Palestinians. So in that sense, numbers, people in Gaza, I actually served in Gaza many years ago as a soldier. In the 1970s, the population was 350,000, and now it's between 2 and 2.5 million people. So the population has grown, conditions have greatly deteriorated.
Yes.
Gaza has been besieged for 16 years now by the Israeli authorities. And if the intention is to move people out of their territory, then what you can say is that there's an indication of ethnic cleansing.
Let me ask you this, Professor. What would you say to Israelis, to fellow Jews who say it's outrageous to accuse us of genocide, given what we've endured in our history, and especially when we're fighting against Hamas, which has expressed genocidal intent towards us? What would you say there?
So the first thing I would say is that indeed Hamas has expressed genocidal intent, and the massacre that it carried out was clearly a war crime and a crime against humanity. So I don't think there's any question about that. To me, as someone who has studied and written on the Holocaust for decades now, what is most outrageous is that an Israeli government, the government of the only Jewish state in the world, is pursuing policies that can easily be identified as policies of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, and is making genocidal statements. That is the most outrageous aspect about this government, a government that was of a state that was created in the wake of the Holocaust, that has said repeatedly, never again. And never again is not only never again against Jews, but never again genocide.
One last question, Professor Bartov. It's not just Israeli politicians engaging in what sounds to many people like genocidal rhetoric, and I mentioned some of that a moment ago. You have U.S. politicians, Republican politicians like Senators Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton talking about leveling Gaza, bouncing the rubble. And yesterday, GOP Congressman Brian Mast said this.
I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians, as is frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II.
How would you describe that rhetoric about Gaza, about the Palestinians, emanating from the GOP here in the United States?
Well, in fact, even the president of the State of Israel said that we should see all Palestinians in Gaza, the population of Gaza, as responsible for the acts of Hamas. And I should say that during World War II, British and American politicians very carefully distinguished between the Nazis, various Nazi organizations, the German military, and the German population, and never talked about the German population as being Nazi. There were many Nazis there, but the point of it was that after the war, you could rebuild Germany, which is what was done. And not eradicated. And so this kind of rhetoric is irresponsible and potentially murderous.
Professor Omar Bartov, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your analysis.
But this is what we couldn't see. The carnage and death being inflicted elsewhere in Gaza as the death toll soars towards 10,000, according to the Hamas-run health authority. Israel striking 2 more refugee camps. It's located in the evacuation zone, where Israel's military is urging families to seek refuge as the IDF focuses its offensive on the north. But there's almost nowhere in Gaza that's safe anymore.
Israel's goal has always been ethnic cleansing. I think a lot of people have been watching what Israel's been doing in Gaza and think to themselves, understandably, how could any country do this? But what I'm about to tell you will make it absolutely clear that wiping out the Palestinians has been Israel's goal all along. It starts with the 19th century movement to create the State of Israel, the Zionist movement. While there's nothing wrong in principle with Jews having a homeland, the Zionist movement insisted that a Jewish state had to be in the heart of the Arab world, Palestine. The slogan for the Zionist movement was a land for a people without a land. Of course, Palestine wasn't a land without a people. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs already lived there. This immediately created a problem for the Zionist movement. Israel couldn't be a Jewish state if the majority of people weren't Jewish. The Zionist movement knew that the only way they could actually have a Jewish state in Palestine was to kick the Arabs out and move Jews in, and they openly wrote about this. Leading Zionist Israel Zangwill wrote, "Palestine is not so much occupied by Arabs as overrun by them. They're nomads, and therefore we must persuade them to trek." Another leading Zionist and future Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, put it more bluntly, saying, "We must expel the Arabs and take their place." The Zionist movement was also completely aware that they'd have to take the land by force. Another Zionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, wrote, "A voluntary agreement between us and the Arabs of Palestine is inconceivable. Every indigenous people will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of foreign settlement. This is how the Arabs will behave so long as they possess a gleam of hope that they can prevent Palestine from becoming the land of Israel." This didn't deter the Zionist movement, though. Jabotinsky goes on to write, "Settlement of Palestine can develop behind an iron wall, which the Arabs will be powerless to break down." Zionism is often mistakenly referred to as a movement for Jewish salvation, but Zionism had a distinct colonial character from its inception. Whereas most liberation movements involve a group of people ridding themselves of foreign occupiers on their land, Zionists saw themselves as a Western force that would bring civility to the backwards Arab world. Leader of the Zionist movement Theodor Herzl wrote, "If it's God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, we should like to do so as representatives of Western civilization and bring cleanliness, order, and well-established customs to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient." For decades, Zionism lacked the support of the vast majority of Jews and relied mostly on ultra-rich aristocratic European families to finance itself. To gain traction, the Zionist movement also tried to make itself useful to Europe's leading imperialists. In 1902, Theodor Herzl wrote a letter to Cecil Rhodes, the infamous British imperialist who carved the British Empire's path through southern Africa. In the letter, Herzl wrote, "You're being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you? Because it is something colonial." Let's think about this for a sec. If Zionism really was a liberation movement, why would they seek an alliance with one of the greatest oppressors of humankind in history? Why would they expect to win his support? Almost all of the European imperialists that supported the Zionist movement were motivated by anti-Semitism. To them, Zionism was a great excuse to get Jews out of their country. The Zionist movement even struck a similar agreement with Nazi Germany. While the worldwide Jewish community was boycotting German businesses in the early 30s, the Zionist movement struck an agreement with the Nazis called the Havara Agreement. It allowed Jews emigrating from Germany to Palestine to exchange their assets for German-made goods, which they then sold and received the proceeds of. While Zionism became hegemonic in Jewish communities following the horrors of the Holocaust, Zionism itself and the notion of a Jewish state in Palestine far predate the Holocaust and were firmly rooted in the idea that Palestine should be ethnically cleansed to make room for Jewish settlement. It's not a coincidence that the day Israelis mark as Israeli Independence Day, May 14th, Palestinians remember as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, a series of massacres that forced 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes. Israel's founding is quite literally synonymous with terror and displacement for Palestinians, just as the Zionists said it would be. In the words of Israeli General Moshe Dayan, Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You don't even know the names of these Arab villages because these geography books no longer exist. There's not one single place built in this country that didn't have a former Arab population. Last week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech where he described Israel's expanding war in Gaza as Israel's second war of independence. In other words, he's saying that Israel intends to finish what the first war started, the expulsion of all Palestinians from historic Palestine. To Palestinians, it's obvious what this means. A second independence war means a second Nakba. The first Nakba turned 750,000 Palestinians into refugees. But in just the last 4 weeks, Israel has created 1.4 million displaced persons in Gaza. The Zionist movement has been openly stating their genocidal intent for the Palestinians, not just in the last 4 weeks, not just for the last 75 years, but even before that, when the state of Israel was just an idea. We know what their end goal is. The only question that remains is, this time, will the world let it happen?